Okay, so our next speaker is Pierre-Alexandre Morin from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine in the University of Montreal. And the title of this presentation is Inter-Observer Agreements on Body Condition Scores and on the Difference in Body Condition Scores in Dairy Cows. Pierre, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, everyone. So today I will talk about inter-observer agreements on a single body condition score and on a variation. And by variation of body condition score, I mean the difference between two assessments taken at two different times. So body condition score is a really easy, fast, and inexpensive measurement used to assess the energy reserve, principally fat and protein, under forms of tissue over the lumbar and pelvic regions. A chart was developed by Wildman in the 80s and then improved in the 90s by Ferguson, who had subcategories. He described the relationship between anatomical marker and BCS. So those anatomical markers are the coxofemoral joint, the iliac tuberosity, the ischial tuberosity, transverse processes, the iliosacral ligaments, and the ischiococcygeal ligaments. As it was emphasized by Dr. Roche, a lot of energy reserve are mobilized in early lactation. So the difference of two measures of body condition score taken at two different times can inform us about how an animal had used its energy reserve. It can be a loss or gain. In fact, the recommendations coming out of BCS measures more often use the variation of BCS than only a single BCS assessment. While agreement between observers of a single BCS assessment is well documented, the literature is poor when it comes to the agreement for a variation in BCS. So to assess that lack of information, we decide to compare if agreement between three experienced observers of a variation in BCS when both assessments were performed by the same evaluator with the agreement of a single BCS assessment. Our hypothesis at this time is that agreement for variation in BCS when both assessments are performed by the same evaluator can be stronger than the agreement for a single assessment if the error is of BCS between observer is systematic. But if this error is random, then the agreement for a variation in BCS will be lower than the agreement for a single BCS assessment. Just to illustrate that, in the situation where a given observer will systematically overestimate by 0.5 point compared to a second observer, then the difference of the measures taken at two different times will be will be zero. The agreement will be perfect. Here you have the two observers, and on the arrow you have the assessment taken at different times, maybe 4 weeks in difference. But if it's a random error, then like if one of the assessor always overestimate in the extreme, like if the observer 2 said that a cow is fatter or a cow is leaner than observer 2, then it will be the disagreement between the variation will be more important. So to verify our hypothesis, the three graders did 2 assessments on all animals. In fact, there was 73 animals that we just recruited as the calves. So the first reading was effectuated during the first one of the first 3 weeks of lactation, and the second exam was performed during the 6th to 8th week of lactation. A minimum of 4 weeks were respected between those 2 assessments. A common way to report agreement between observers for qualitative measurements is to compute a kappa statistic, which reports agreement beyond chance. On the bottom, you have a table with the interpretation. I will just ask you to remember the last 3 categories: moderate, strong to almost perfect, because we will use it later on. So a bit of descriptive statistics. For all pairs of observer, we did scatter plots. You have the observation of observer 2 on the vertical axis and of observer 1 on the horizontal axis. You can see that there's the shift on the slope is really similar to the perfect agreement line corresponding to the dashed line, or so it's the perfect agreement line for exam 1 and exam 2, while for the variation of BCS, or the difference between 2 measures, it is the shift is really more important. Almost perfect disagreement, then agreement, sorry. Then the point 25 were observed in 93% of observation, while perfect agreement, while observed in 48 of observations. For the variation of BCS, smaller disagreement than point 25 points were observed in 84% of observation, while perfect agreement were observed in 33%. Here are the kappa value for the pair observer, and you can see that it is really a strong agreement to almost perfect agreement for exam 1 and exam 2, while for the variation between exam 2 and 1, it was moderate. In the box, you have the values of agreements for the overall agreement for the 3 observers. So this is in accordance with what we saw in the scatter plots. So in short, with the result we get in our study, we can say that the systematic error on BCS is not probable, and it is more likely to be a random error. So the recommendation for future studies or herd, we use it as a herd management tool for variation of energy reserves, is that depending on the experience of the evaluators, when only one assessment is of interest, because inter-observer agreement is strong, many evaluators could be considered as well as only one. When the variation of BCS is of interest, only one evaluator should do the measurements because inter-observer agreement is moderate and results will be less reliable. These recommendations were already the general feeling, but the study brings science to that. Maybe someday we will have tools to make more objective BCS measurements and allow strong inter-observer agreement when a BCS variation is the measure of interest. As an example, Bayer just created a smartphone application allowing that. It's free, simple, but unfortunately, it takes longer to make measures. I have not found yet literature about inter-observer agreement for this application, but it is an interesting avenue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Alexandre, and we have time for some questions. I'm glad somebody decided to look at this area. I find my colleagues score them differently to me all the time. Do we have any questions? From the audience? Can I ask you if you've looked at all at different body condition score assessor training methods? So the methodology of actually training the assessor and whether or not that has a big bearing on inter-observer differences?
No, we did not. In fact, the three assessors were, they worked together, so they were trained together. We did not look at that.
Okay, we have a question from the floor.
Jeffrey Fordyce from Australia. Just to, that first question almost stole mine, but one of the strategies we use is to teach body condition scoring by describing the animal and then turning it into a number rather than thinking about a number all the time. So I was just wondering whether you've actually tried that strategy of teaching a description versus teaching a number.
That's a good question. Which strategy? I mean, except that, honestly, I'm not sure I can really answer that question.
Yeah, so for example, we use the reason for the 5-point scale is that 5 is average, 4 is above average, 2 is below average, 1's shocking, and 5 is brilliant. And you can apply that to whatever you do in scoring. And when you come to condition scoring, if you use that experience, cattle people can learn very, very quickly and become very accurate very quickly. And we find that much better of approach than trying to teach what may be a 2.5, for instance.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, yeah.
Okay, I'm sure we'll move forward with methodology through time. So thank you again, Pierre-Alexandre.